The American pilot pulled back on the stick, forcing his fighter into a steep climb that made the engine scream in protest. Below him, 28 Japanese aircraft had already fallen from the sky, each one trailing smoke and fire as it spiraled toward the jungle canopy. His hands were steady on the controls, though his fuel gauge had been flashing red for the past 10 minutes. The P-40 Warhawk beneath him shuddered, breathing maneuver, its patched-together frame groaning under stress that would have torn apart most aircraft. Japanese pilots had nicknamed this plane the Flying Coffin, a bitter acknowledgement of how many American aviators had died inside its cramped cockpit. Yet here he was, defying every expectation, turning their nightmare into reality. The year was 1942, and the Pacific War had reached a turning point that few people back home understood. American newspapers were still printing optimistic headlines about inevitable victory, but the men fighting in Burma knew the truth. Japan's Zero fighters had dominated the skies for months, cutting through Allied squadrons like scissors through paper. The P-40 Warhawk, America's frontline fighter, had earned a reputation as a death trap, too slow to catch the Zero, too heavy to turn with it, too vulnerable to punishment. Pilots whispered that flying one into combat was volunteering for a funeral. The Japanese grew so confident they stopped respecting American aircraft entirely, diving into attacks with reckless abandon, certain their technological superiority made them invincible. But Robert Lee Scott Jr. saw something everyone else had missed. While other pilots cursed the Warhawk's limitations and wrote letters home asking for transfers to better aircraft, Scott studied the machine with the intensity of a chess master, analyzing an opponent's weaknesses. He didn't see a flying coffin. He saw a puzzle that nobody had bothered to solve. Every aircraft, he reasoned, was designed with specific advantages built into its structure. The Zero could turn on a dime and climb like a rocket, yes, but those capabilities came at a cost. Japanese engineers had sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to achieve that performance. One well-placed burst of 50 caliber rounds could turn a Zero into a fireball. The question wasn't whether the P-40 could win. The question was whether an American pilot could think differently enough to exploit what he had. Scott had arrived in Burma through a path nobody would have predicted. He'd spent years begging the Army Air Corps for combat duty, only to be repeatedly assigned to transport missions. At 33 years old, he was considered too old for fighter combat by the bureaucrats who made such decisions. They wanted young men with quick reflexes, not aging captains who'd spent the better part of a decade flying cargo planes across Africa and Asia. But Scott refused to accept that verdict. When he heard that Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers were operating in China with American volunteers, he saw an opportunity that bureaucratic channels would never provide. He essentially went absent without leave from his transport squadron, flying himself to Kunming in a borrowed aircraft, and presenting himself to Chennault as a ready and willing fighter pilot. Chennault was skeptical at first. The legendary aviator had built the Flying Tigers around a carefully selected group of pilots, most of them young Navy and Marine Corps, aviators who'd resigned their commissions to fight for China before America officially entered the war. But he needed every capable pilot he could get, and something about Scott's determination impressed him. More importantly, Scott arrived at exactly the moment when Chennault needed someone to take over the newly formed 23rd Fighter Group, an organization that would carry on the Flying Tigers' legacy after the volunteer unit officially dissolved. The timing was perfect, but the challenge was enormous. Scott would be leading American pilots flying American aircraft under American command, but he'd be doing it with the same impossible odds the Flying Tigers had faced. The P-40 Warhawk represented everything contradictory about American aviation at the war's beginning. It had been designed in the late 1930s when fighter combat still meant gentlemanly dogfights between biplanes where maneuverability mattered more than speed or firepower. By 1942, those assumptions had been obliterated by the realities of modern warfare. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and accelerate the P-40 in almost every scenario. Japanese pilots had been training for years specifically to maximize their aircraft's advantages, practicing the kind of tight radius turns that could bring them onto an opponent's tail in seconds. American pilots arriving in the Pacific discovered they were flying an obsolete design against an enemy who'd perfected the art of aerial combat. The mortality rate for new P-40 pilots was catastrophic. Many didn't survive their first week in theater. Scott understood that trying to fight the Japanese on their terms was suicide. If an American pilot attempted to turn with a Zero, he'd lose every time. The laws of physics made that outcome inevitable. But physics worked both ways, and the P-40 had one overwhelming advantage that most pilots overlooked because they were too focused on what it couldn't do. The Warhawk was built like a tank. Its engine was mounted in a heavy armored cowling that could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that could take bullets without exploding. Most importantly, it could dive faster than almost anything in the sky. That combination created a tactical opportunity if a pilot was willing to completely reimagine how fighter combat worked. Chennault had already figured out the basics of this approach with the Flying Tigers. His pilots had learned to use hit-and-run tactics, diving on Japanese formations from above, firing a burst, and then using their speed to escape before the Zeros could maneuver into position. But Scott took that concept further. He studied every after-action report he could find, interviewed every pilot who'd survived encounters with Japanese fighters, and spent hours visualizing different scenarios. He realized that the key wasn't just avoiding dogfights. The key was controlling the entire geometry of combat, forcing the Japanese to fight in an environment where the P-40's strengths became overwhelming and the Zero's advantages became irrelevant. His first major test came during a mission over Burma that should have been routine. Scott was leading a flight of 4 Warhawks on a sweep near Rangoon when Japanese radar operators detected them and scrambled a full squadron of Zeros to intercept. The odds were roughly 4 Americans against 12 Japanese. Exactly the kind of situation that usually ended with American pilots being shot down or fleeing for their lives. Scott's wingmen were experienced enough to know how dangerous the situation had become, but they'd also learned to trust their commander's instincts. When Scott's voice came crackling over the radio with instructions, they followed without hesitation, even though what he was telling them to do violated every standard tactical doctrine they'd been taught. Instead of turning to meet the Japanese head-on or attempting to climb for altitude advantage, Scott did something that seemed insane. He pushed his throttle forward in dove, leading his formation down toward the jungle canopy at a speed that made his aircraft shake violently. His wingmen followed, their P-40 screaming through the air as they dropped thousands of feet in seconds. The Japanese pilots saw this maneuver and interpreted it as panic, as American cowardice in the face of superior numbers. They rolled their Zeros into pursuit, eager to catch the fleeing Americans and add 4 more kills to their record. This was exactly what Scott wanted them to think. What the Japanese didn't realize was that they'd just made a fatal mistake. By diving to pursue the Americans, they'd surrendered their altitude advantage and entered the P-40's kill zone. Scott pulled out of his dive at treetop level, his airspeed indicator showing numbers that most pilots would consider dangerous. Then he did something that contradicted every instinct a fighter pilot develops. He didn't try to turn and fight. He leveled off and kept flying straight, maintaining his speed, waiting for the perfect moment. The Zeros were faster in a dive, but they couldn't sustain that speed. As the Japanese pilots began pulling out of their descent to maneuver into firing position, their aircraft slowed down dramatically. That was the moment Scott had been waiting for. He hauled his P-40 into a climbing turn, not trying to match the Zero's turning radius, but using his speed to zoom climb above them. His wingmen did the same, executing the maneuver with synchronized precision. Suddenly, the geometry had reversed. The Americans were above the Japanese, diving down with tremendous speed advantage, their 650 caliber machine guns hammering out rounds at a combined rate that could saw through metal like a blowtorch. Scott's first burst caught a Zero pilot completely by surprise, stitching a line of holes across the aircraft's unarmored fuselage and engine. The Japanese fighter disintegrated in a ball of flames so sudden that the pilot probably never knew what hit him. The other Zeros scattered, their formation discipline collapsing as panic replaced confidence. Scott's wingmen each claimed kills in the next 30 seconds, their diving attacks catching Japanese pilots who were still trying to process what had just happened. The Americans weren't supposed to fight this way. They were supposed to run or die, not turn the tables with tactics that seemed to defy logic. Scott zoomed back up to altitude, rolled over, and dove again on another target. His machine guns roared, and another Zero fell apart in midair, its lightweight construction offering no protection against the heavy American rounds. In less than 3 minutes, the engagement was over. 4 P-40s had destroyed 6 Japanese fighters without taking a single hit in return. The surviving Zeros fled toward their base, their pilots radiating confused reports about American tactics they'd never encountered before. Word of the engagement spread through both sides' intelligence networks within hours. Japanese commanders initially didn't believe the reports, assuming their pilots had encountered some new American fighter they hadn't been briefed about. When they confirmed it was the same P-40 Warhawks they'd been shooting down for months, they were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. And the problem wasn't American equipment. The problem was that someone had figured out how to use it correctly. For the American pilots in Scott's squadron, the engagement was even more revelatory. They'd been flying missions with a sense of fatalistic resignation, expecting to die eventually because their aircraft couldn't compete with Japanese technology. Suddenly, they realized they'd been thinking about the problem wrong. The P-40 wasn't a coffin. It was a sledgehammer that required a completely different kind of hand to wield effectively. Scott began training his pilots obsessively in the new tactics, running them through drill after drill until the maneuvers became instinctive. They practiced diving attacks until they could execute them without thinking, practiced zoom climbs until they could judge altitude and speed with perfect precision, practiced formation flying so tight that they moved as a single unit rather than individual aircraft. Most importantly, he taught them to think about combat as a physics problem rather than an emotional confrontation. Young pilots naturally wanted to prove their bravery by mixing it up with the enemy in traditional dogfights, but Scott hammered into them that courage without intelligence was just another word for suicide. The goal wasn't to prove you were brave. The goal was to kill Japanese pilots while staying alive to kill more tomorrow. The results were extraordinary. Scott's squadron began racking up kill ratios that made staff officers back in Washington question whether the reports were exaggerated. In engagement after engagement, his P-40s destroyed Japanese fighters at rates of 3-1, 4-1, sometimes higher. Japanese pilots who'd grown accustomed to dominating American aircraft found themselves on the defensive, never knowing when a P-40 might come screaming down from above with its guns blazing. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese aviators began reporting that American fighters were faster than intelligence had indicated, or that the Americans must have received new aircraft because the combat outcomes didn't match what they'd been told to expect. But Scott wasn't content with defensive victories. He understood that the Pacific War would be won or lost based on who could project power over vast distance, and that meant taking the fight to the enemy. He began planning long-range missions deep into Japanese-held territory, strikes that would hit airfields, supply depots, and infrastructure that Japan assumed was safely beyond American reach. These missions required careful calculation because the P-40's range was limited. Scott had to plot courses that would get his fighters to their targets, give them enough time to attack, and still leave sufficient fuel to return home. The margin for error was razor thin. If he miscalculated by even a few miles, his pilots would run out of fuel over enemy territory and be forced to bail out or crash land in hostile jungle. One particular mission exemplified both the opportunity and the danger. Japanese forces had established a major fighter base at Chiang Mai in northern Thailand, using it as a staging point for attacks into Burma and China. The base was heavily defended, surrounded by anti-aircraft batteries, and located far enough from American bases that striking it would push the P-40's range to its absolute limit. Scott studied reconnaissance photos of the target for days, memorizing every detail of the airfield's layout. He identified the dispersal areas where Japanese aircraft would be parked between missions, calculated the timing needed to catch them on the ground, and planned an approach route that would bring his fighters in from an unexpected direction. The mission launched before dawn with Scott leading 8 P-40s loaded with light bombs and full ammunition. They flew at low altitude to avoid Japanese radar, navigating by compass and dead reckoning across hundreds of miles of mountainous terrain. Every pilot in the formation knew they were pushing beyond their normal operating envelope. If they encountered unexpected headwinds or if the Japanese had moved their aircraft, the entire mission could turn into a disaster. Scott maintained radio silence, his fighters spreading out into a loose formation that would make them harder to spot from the ground. The sun was just rising behind them when the airfield came into view. What Scott saw made his pulse quicken. The Japanese had no idea anyone was coming. Dozens of fighters and bombers sat parked in neat rows along the runway, their pilots and ground crews going about their morning routines with the casual confidence of people who believed they were safe from attack. Scott didn't give them time to react. He rolled his P-40 into a steep dive, aiming for the center of the parked aircraft formation, his thumb hovering over the bomb release trigger. His wingmen followed him down in a screaming descent that must have sounded like thunder to the people below. The bombs hit first, erupting in geysers of flame and shrapnel that tore through unarmored aircraft like they were made of paper. Scott pulled up from the bombing run and immediately transitioned into a strafing path, his machine guns ripping into targets that were now scrambling to escape. The fuel tanks exploded, ammunition cooked off in secondary explosions, and ground crew personnel dove for cover as 50 caliber rounds churned up the earth around them. The other 7 P-40s followed in sequence, each one adding to the destruction, each pilot focusing on a different section of the airfield to maximize coverage. In less than 2 minutes, the base was transformed into a scene of apocalyptic devastation. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries finally opened fire, but they were too late and too disorganized to be effective. Scott led his formation out of the target area at maximum speed, staying low to make themselves harder targets, the P-40's engines roaring as they clawed for distance. Behind them, black smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the air, visible for miles in every direction. Post-strike reconnaissance would later confirm that the raid destroyed or damaged more than 30 Japanese aircraft on the ground, effectively neutralizing the base for weeks. Not a single American aircraft was lost. The mission became legendary within the China-Burma-India theater, proving that aggressive tactics and careful planning could overcome even the most daunting odds. But it was the aerial combat missions where Scott truly built his reputation. Day after day, he led his pilots into engagements against Japanese fighters, and day after day, they came back with more kills and fewer losses than anyone thought possible with the P-40. His personal tally began climbing steadily. 5 victories, 10, 15. Each one represented not just a successful engagement, but a validation of the tactics he developed. Other American squadrons began requesting transfers to Scott's unit, wanting to learn from the man who turned the P-40 from a liability into a weapon. Japanese intelligence officers marked him as a priority target, circulating descriptions of his aircraft and instructions to focus fire on the squadron commander whenever possible. The pressure was enormous. Scott flew mission after mission, sometimes multiple sorties in a single day, pushing himself to exhaustion because he knew his squadron's success depended on his leadership. He studied gun camera footage from every engagement, analyzing what had worked and what hadn't, looking for patterns in Japanese tactics that could be exploited. He debriefed his pilots after every mission, extracting every detail about what they'd seen and experienced, turning their collective knowledge into tactical doctrine that saved lives. The mental strain was as intense as the physical danger. Every decision he made could mean the difference between his pilots coming home or being shot down. Every tactical innovation he developed had to be tested in actual combat where mistakes were measured in burning wreckage and lost friends. The Japanese response evolved as they began to understand what they were facing. Enemy pilots started refusing to follow diving P-40s, having learned that pursuing them was a trap. They began positioning themselves more carefully, trying to force the Americans into extended turning engagements where the Zero's superior maneuverability would tell. Scott countered by varying his tactics, sometimes feinting toward a dogfight only to break off at the last moment, drawing Japanese fighters out of position. He began coordinating with other squadrons, setting up ambushes where one group of P-40s would act as bait while another dove in from above. The air war became a deadly chess match played at 300 miles per hour, where both sides were constantly adapting to counter the other's latest innovation. Through it all, Scott's kill count continued to climb. 20 victories, 25. Each one harder won than the last as the Japanese learned to respect American tactics and became more cautious at engaging. But Scott's advantage wasn't just tactical skill. It was his absolute mastery of the P-40 itself. He knew exactly how much stress the airframe could take before something broke. He knew precisely how much altitude he needed to complete a zoom climb and still have enough energy to escape. He knew the sound his engine made when it was running at maximum sustainable power versus the slightly different note that meant he was about to blow a cylinder. This intimate knowledge of his machine allowed him to extract performance that other pilots couldn't match, to push the aircraft right to the edge of its envelope without crossing into catastrophic failure. The mission that would cement his legend came during a bomber escort assignment that turned into the largest air battle he'd ever experienced. American bombers were striking a Japanese supply depot, and Scott's squadron drew the assignment of protecting them from fighter interception. Intelligence had predicted moderate Japanese response, maybe a dozen fighters. Instead, they encountered more than 50 enemy aircraft in multiple waves, a response so overwhelming that the bomber crews began radiating distress calls almost immediately. Scott found himself leading 8 P-40s against odds that would have justified breaking off and running. Instead, he pressed the attack. The next 20 minutes became a blur of diving attacks, zoom climbs, and split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. Scott destroyed 4 Japanese fighters in quick succession, each kill the result of perfect deflection shooting as he raked his guns across targets that were trying desperately to evade. His wingmen claimed 3 more, their discipline holding even as Japanese fighters swarmed around them like angry hornets. The bombers completed their run and turned for home, still protected by Scott's squadron despite being outnumbered 6-1. More Japanese fighters fell to American guns as the engagement continued, Scott's tactical system proving its worth under the most extreme pressure imaginable. When his squadron finally broke contact and headed home, Scott's gun barrels were so hot they'd warped slightly from sustained firing. His aircraft was riddled with bullet holes from near misses and his fuel gauge showed almost nothing left. But every bomber returned safely, and his squadron hadn't lost a single fighter. The mission earned him official recognition from headquarters, but more importantly, it earned him the unwavering loyalty of every pilot under his command. They'd seen him lead them through hell and bring them out alive, had watched him destroy enemy aircraft with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. They trusted him completely because he'd proven repeatedly that his tactical vision could overcome impossible odds. Scott's personal victory count reached 28 confirmed kills during his time in China, Burma, India, though historians later acknowledged that the actual number was probably higher. Many engagements happened far from friendly territory where there were no witnesses to confirm kills, and Scott himself was notoriously conservative about claiming victories unless he was absolutely certain an enemy aircraft was destroyed. The 28 confirmed kills made him one of the highest-scoring American aces in the theater, but the numbers only told part of the story. His real contribution was proving that American pilots could defeat the Japanese Zero. Despite flying supposedly inferior equipment, that tactical innovation and disciplined execution mattered more than raw technical specification. The lessons Scott taught spread throughout the American fighter community. His tactics manual was distributed to squadrons across the Pacific, and pilots who'd trained under him carried his methods to other units. The P-40 never stopped being a challenging aircraft to fly, and it remained inferior to the Zero in many technical specifications until better American fighters, like the P-38 and P-51, arrived in theater. But it stopped being a flying coffin. It became a weapon that American pilots could use effectively if they understood its limitations and fought within its strengths. Japanese pilots learned to fear the sight of P-40s diving from altitude because they knew what was coming and knew they couldn't stop it without taking unacceptable losses. Scott eventually returned to the United States in 1943 after months of continuous combat operations left him physically and mentally exhausted. The Army Air Corps promoted him to colonel and used him for war bond tours and public relations, recognizing that his story represented exactly the kind of heroic narrative that motivated people back home. But Scott himself seemed ambivalent about the attention. He'd gone to war believing that combat would be glorious and that destroying enemy aircraft would feel like victory. Instead, he discovered that war was mostly exhaustion, stress, and the constant awareness that the next mission might be your last. His memoir, published after the war, captured some of that complexity, portraying air combat not as adventure but as a grinding test of endurance where survival depended on doing everything right and hoping luck stayed on your side. The P-40 Warhawk itself remained in production until 1944, by which point nearly 14,000 had been built. It served in every theater of World War II, flown by American, British, Soviet, and Chinese pilots. Its combat record was mixed. In the hands of poorly trained pilots using conventional tactics, it suffered terrible losses against modern German and Japanese fighters. But in the hands of pilots who understood its strengths, who'd learned the lessons Scott and Chenault had pioneered, it could be devastatingly effective. The aircraft's legacy became a testament to the importance of tactical adaptation, proof that wars aren't won simply by having better technology, but by using whatever tools you have with intelligence and creativity. What makes Scott's achievement remarkable in retrospect isn't just that he shot down 28 enemy aircraft, it's that he fundamentally changed how Americans thought about fighter combat in the Pacific. Before Scott, the standard assumption was that American pilots needed better aircraft to compete with Japanese technology. After Scott, commanders understood that tactics and training could overcome equipment disadvantages, that seemingly obsolete aircraft could remain viable if employed correctly. This insight influenced aircraft procurement, pilot training programs, and tactical doctrine for the rest of the war. Young pilots arriving in the Pacific after 1943 were taught Scott's methods from day one, learning to fight in ways that previous generations had never considered. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to the boom and zoom tactics Scott perfected. Their entire aviation culture was built around the philosophy that maneuverability and pilot skill would prevail in any engagement, that the best fighter was the one that could outturn its opponent. The Zero embodied that philosophy, and Japanese training reinforced it constantly. American tactics that refused to play that game, that treated combat as a problem in physics rather than a test of courage, simply didn't fit within their tactical framework. By the time Japanese designers began producing fighters with heavier armor and more powerful engines to counter American advantages, it was too late. The tide had turned, and American industry was producing aircraft in quantities that Japan could never match. The larger lesson transcended aviation. Scott's success demonstrated that technological inferiority isn't destiny, that intelligent adaptation can overcome seemingly insurmountable advantages. The P-40 was objectively a worse fighter than the Zero in almost every measurable category. It was slower in a climb, less maneuverable, less responsive. But Scott refused to accept that those specifications determined outcomes. He looked at the problem from a different angle, asked different questions, and discovered solutions that more conventional thinkers had missed. That kind of creative problem-solving, applied under life or death pressure, represented exactly the quality that separates competent practitioners from revolutionary innovators. In the decades after the war, P-40's reputation underwent a gradual rehabilitation. For years, it was remembered primarily as the fighter that American pilots had to fly before better aircraft became available, a necessary but unglamorous workhorse that lacked the sexy appeal of the Mustang or the Thunderbolt. But historians studying the Pacific War began recognizing that the P-40's supposed inadequacies were largely a matter of doctrine rather than design. The aircraft could succeed spectacularly when employed properly, and its failure in many early engagements reflected mistakes in how it was used rather than fundamental flaws in the machine itself. Scott's combat record stood as irrefutable proof of what the aircraft could accomplish in the right hands. Today, aviation museums display restored P-40 Warhawks with reverence, their shark-mouth paint schemes and patched aluminum skin reminding visitors of a time when American pilots flew obsolete equipment against an enemy that seemed unbeatable. The aircraft represents a specific moment in aviation history when wars were won as much by human ingenuity as by technological advancement, when a single innovative commander could change the course of an entire theater's air campaign simply by thinking differently about the tools he'd been given. Scott's 28 victories serve as markers along that journey, each one a small triumph of intelligence over circumstance. What the Japanese called a flying coffin became their nightmare because one American pilot refused to accept conventional wisdom about what was possible. He looked at an aircraft everyone else had written off and saw potential that others missed. He developed tactics that seemed counterintuitive, but proved devastatingly effective. He trained his pilots to think strategically rather than emotionally, to value survival as much as victory, to understand that killing the enemy wasn't about being brave enough to dogfight, but about being smart enough to create situations where you couldn't lose. Those lessons, learned in the skies over Burma against an enemy that had dominated every previous engagement, changed how America fought the air war and helped turn the tide in a conflict where every advantage mattered desperately. The plane nobody wanted became a weapon that helped win a war, piloted by a man who understood that limitations only matter if you accept them as final.